Welcome to TISConversations, where we discuss issues related to understanding life from a trauma-informed lens. I'm Heather Forbes with the Beyond Consequences Institute. In today's episode, we're going to have a science-based conversation with Dr. Andrew Newberg. So welcome, Dr. Newberg.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on your program.
So instead of having me read a boring bio, which is not boring, but I want to just give it over to you to give our listeners a little understanding of who you are and what you do.
Well, I was going to say, I worked hard for that bio.
No, I didn't mean it was boring. When I read it, it's boring. So you give it to us.
No, I appreciate it. I have kind of a fairly complex background. I'm a physician and did training in both internal medicine and the field of nuclear medicine, which is a lot of imaging studies, and basically used the imaging studies to look at a variety of different neurological and psychiatric conditions, including neurodegenerative diseases, depression, anxiety, trauma, and so forth. But also over time became very interested in looking at what might be called integrative medicine, and that includes kind of traditional medicine, but also a lot of complementary types of practices, evidence-based practices that include mind-body medicine, diet and nutrition, different supplements, and so forth, all with the idea of trying to ultimately put together a very individualized training program and healthcare program for everyone. And in my current position here at Thomas Jefferson University, I'm the research director of the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health, and really with the idea of trying to show how these different integrative approaches can be beneficial and trying to understand the physiology of what's going on. So if you do a meditation practice to help with anxiety, not only does it help the anxiety, but what's going on in the brain itself? Does it shut down certain areas? Does it turn on certain areas? What are all the different complex processes that are going on inside of the person that may have an important impact? So, even more specifically, with regard to the mind-body aspect, I've gotten very interested in studying various religious and spiritual practices and experiences, a field that's sometimes referred to as neurotheology, and really looking at sort of how our brain and our spiritual selves intersect, and trying to use that information to understand really who we are as human beings, and ranging all the way from very practical questions that have therapeutic implications to fairly esoteric questions about theological and philosophical ideas. So that's really who I am and how I've gotten here.
Yes, it's an impressive bio. And I met you, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 years ago, just at a conference. And what really struck me was your work also, and your book. You have several books. So the book that I'm referring to was Why We Believe What We Believe, and understanding then how our belief systems really navigate how our life then unfolds. So I want to definitely go into that a little bit. But first, I also want to bring up another book you wrote, and that one is called Words Can Change Your Brain. And that one I think is so imperative, because what I'd like to do is to take all this knowledge that you have and transform it and see if we can apply it into the classroom. Now, I know you're not an educator, but certainly all this information is applicable to understanding then when students are stressed out, when they are physiologically very dysregulated, how we can move in and be able to support them. So I'm going to stretch you on that, because your book talks about how to move things, how to have compassionate communication with couples and then in the workplace. So I'm going to add a little section to your book, if you don't mind, bringing compassionate communication to the classroom. So
Absolutely.
Talk a little bit about that whole idea of compassionate communication and how it relates to the brain science.
Well, it really started. We were looking at so many different ways in which human beings communicate and think about ideas. And it grew out of that basic aspect of our research, also thinking about practices like mindfulness and other meditation-based practices and how that changes our brain, but how that ultimately relates to the language and the words that we use. The idea ultimately kind of grew from there, was that we wanted to use science and look at what we can know about the brain to help us to develop the best kinds of communication skills and techniques that would really be able to help bring people together more effectively. So for example, we said, well, what do we know about language? How does it work? How do we learn things and communicate with other people? And it starts with maybe something very simple, a concept called working memory, which is that our brain can really hold on to about 4 or 5 chunks of information at any given time. So if you kind of, figure that out in terms of time frame, maybe 30 seconds worth of information. So if you're in a conversation, and particularly more of an argument, for example, with someone, sometimes one person will go on and on for 10 minutes or 15 minutes at a time. But what this means is that the other person in the conversation really can't hold on to all of that information. They really can't gather in and hold all that stuff that's being said. So we said, well, maybe the first part of compassionate communication is speaking briefly, trying to get out what you want to say in 10, 15 seconds worth of communication. And so this is kind of how we started to develop the whole concept of compassionate communication. We said, well, what about how people talk? Data, again, the research studies show that when people start to slow the rate down of the words that they use, that people are able to understand it better than if you're talking really quickly and trying to go through as much information as you possibly can. So if you slow the pace of your language down, people can understand you more effectively as well. So here we have 2, very quick things that we can say about compassionate communication, which is to speak briefly and to speak slowly. And then part of it has to do with, if you're going to really have compassionate communication, meaning that you understand what the other person is really thinking and dealing with in their own mind, that you now have to, after you speak, you need to listen and listen deeply to what that person is saying and try to see how that's making you react. What are your own personal interactions? How do you understand what they're thinking and so forth? And then again, then you respond and you go back and forth in this kind of resonant kind of process, this rhythmic process, where if you do these kinds of things and some of the other elements of compassionate communication that we'll talk about later, that you really get to a very intimate conversation in a very quick period of time. So this has all kinds of important implications for, as you mentioned, the workplace, but also for schools, for training, for teaching, for dealing with various issues and problems, whether it's with a child, with a teacher. How do you begin to discuss these problems with somebody? Well, again, if you just kind of come at them real aggressively, most likely that's not going to be all that helpful. Whereas if you truly try to understand where they're coming from and why they're thinking the way they are and why they're behaving the way they are, then you are far more likely to be able to get to the root of whatever the issues are, with the goal of trying to, 1, be empathic and understand where they're coming from, but 2, really try to help them solve the problems or deal with the issues that they're dealing with and become more effective in their own, learning and their own communicating as well.
I totally agree with you there. I wonder what does it mean then when we're working with students who their brain's anger center is highly stimulated? I would only guess then that that would be more applicable in situations like that. And then also when we look, like you had mentioned, doing brain scans and understanding just the physiology of the body, how does all that relate then to the physiology of a body, especially with someone who is in a high state of arousal?
Right. Well, so another very important thing that you just are bringing up here has to do, again, with the research that's out there in terms of brain scans and looking at what happens when we are focused on negative words and when we are focused on negative emotions versus when we're focused on positive words and positive emotions. So when a person is kind of resting in a lot of negativity, a number of things are going on. For example, in the brain, you're typically activating a structure called the amygdala, which is part of your limbic system. And brain scans showed that this area turns on whenever we have strong emotions, usually strong negative emotions. But the amygdala connects not only to other parts of the brain, but also to the body itself. And so it connects through a structure called the hypothalamus to regulate your body's responses and your body's reactivity and it turns on your body's arousal response, the fight or flight response. So it gets the body very revved up, their heart rate goes up, their blood pressure goes up, they're basically ready for a fight. And so when people are in that kind of a state, it's very challenging, obviously, to have a good conversation with them. So part of what we talk a lot about in the discussion about compassionate communication is we need to find ways of helping people to reduce that level of arousal and reduce that level of angst and anger, if you will. Part of how we do that is by being the other person in the conversation and slowing your language down, trying to be very conscious about being empathic and listening to what the other person has to say, and most importantly, reflecting on your own reactions to them. Because if you can remain calm, if you can remain in a more positive emotional set point, then there's a high likelihood that they will start to evolve into something that becomes more positive. In fact, we talk a lot about mirror neurons, and some people who are listening might have heard of that. These mirror neurons, which are in our brain, basically reflect what another person is doing. On a very crude level, that means that if I raise my right arm, there's a part of your brain that raises your right arm. But more specifically, when it comes to emotions, if you are angry and making, angered, hateful speech at somebody, then they are likely to respond in the same way. On the other hand, if they find a way of dissipating that anger, and if they try to think about something positive to say, something that might be supportive, keeping the level of the voice and the reactivity down so that you're talking in this kind of calm voice, then it will ultimately calm them down. Their mirror neurons will reflect what you're doing. And so there are ways of helping people through these kinds of very, negative emotional set points, but it can be a very effective way of helping people to get to a different way of thinking about things. And in the long run, over time, what we also know is that the more you are stressed, the more you are angry, the more those are the neural connections that get supported in the brain. So if every day you come in angry, then part of it is what happens is that those neural connections that support anger just get more and more entrenched. Whereas if you can kind of dissipate that and get them into a more positive emotional set point, then those are the neural connections that get stronger. And the neural connections that support that anger will actually become weaker and ultimately fade away. So we can change, but it can be a challenge and it can be difficult. But trying to get people out of those very negative emotional states is difficult, but not impossible. And trying to follow a kind of program like the compassionate communication program that we talk about in Words Can Change Your Brain is something that really can be very helpful for people. And even if they're not engaging in the communication well with you, you can still engage in it with them and hope that they will start to come around to a more positive way of thinking about things.
So much to unpack there. So what I visualize here, because I'm such a visual person, is that let's take two scenarios. Let's say you have a student who is super angry and you have a teacher then that is at their wit's end and you have this combative conversation, right? So that's situation A. Situation B, then you have again the student who is angry and upset, but then you have a teacher who is well regulated and is doing all the things that you're saying and calming down. So if I were at that moment in time, just hold everything and put some sort of brain scan on top of group A and then a brain scan on top of group B, describe to us what we would be seeing. Because I think that's the visual we have to start understanding is that this is a physiological issue. It is not an issue of just saying, oh, Johnny or Billy, go sit down and think about what you've done. It's literally at the brain level and at the whole physiological system.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I mean, the negative emotions, they elicit the reaction of your amygdala, which turns, your many different parts of the emotional centers of your brain on. It releases different neurochemicals like cortisol in the body, your stress your stress hormone, and these they don't go away, immediately. So it really is a lasting kind of state that your brain can be in. The other thing, which is really important to note as well, is that when you're in a highly negative emotional state, you have this interesting balance between the frontal parts of the brain, your frontal lobe behind your forehead, and these emotional centers, the amygdala and what's called the limbic system. it's a bit of a, kind of a balance, like a seesaw. And that's why if you are able to kind of meditate and use that kind of higher cognitive processes, then you can regulate those emotional responses. On the other hand, when any of us get angry, the opposite happens. The emotions go up and all of the cognitive processes go down. And that's why so often when we get angry, we say things without thinking, because we're literally not thinking. And as you were saying, I mean, it is a physiological process. So it takes time to settle that physiology down. And if you were to ultimately, set up a scenario where you had a teacher, for example, in your example, that would be more calm, then the hope is that that amygdala will stop firing as much, that other areas of the brain, the more positive emotional areas of the brain will start to turn on. And also some of the higher cognitive processes and what we call the cortical areas will start to come online, so that the person who you're engaged with actually can start thinking about things. And you might be able to have a conversation about, well, tell me why are you angry? What is upsetting you? What specifically is going on in the classroom? What's specifically going on in your life that is upsetting you? And that's the only that's 10 seconds worth of statement. And then you can spend time listening to what they have to say. And then you can respond to it if they're having problems at home. Well, are these problems that are something that we can help with in some kind of way? What do you think about those particular problems? Are there ways of helping to solve some of them that you can think of? And so, but again, if you keep working with them through that process, then you get them to a more solution-oriented approach, a more cognitive-oriented approach, and hopefully you can kind of redirect them from that very negative perspective and very negative emotional processing to a more positive one. And maybe the last thing to say as another answer to your question is that some interesting brain scan studies have shown that when you are engaged in a very meaningful conversation with another individual, the brains themselves actually resonate with each other. The areas that turn on kind of turn on together, and you anticipate what the other person is thinking and feeling. So you really have an opportunity to be able to do that. Now, again, one of the other pieces to all of this is you're bringing up, specifically in the context of children and students, is that you also have brains that are not as fully developed. And so a lot of those cognitive and those cortical areas are not online at certainly at the same level they are in an adult. And so, that challenge can be even greater at times because, they just don't have that cognitive bandwidth to be able to help regulate those emotional responses as well. And that does make it more challenging at times. But again, I think, part of the overall goal is to get them to be able to do that more effectively, so that as they grow and develop, that they're growing and developing with these positive emotional processes as opposed to the negative ones.
I'm so glad you brought up the developmental side of this, because especially for the students that I work with, they definitely are behind even developmentally. So chronologically, you might be having a discussion with a 15-year-old, but cognitively and all the other parts of their development, they might be more like the 11 or 12-year-old. So I think we also have to keep that in mind. Here's the other aspect of that, is that so many of our students don't trust because they have been in relationships with adults who have hurt them. That can be a parent, that can be actually someone else in their life, or maybe a school they were at prior to where they are now. And so a lot of our kids will walk into the classroom completely distrustful. And I've always said, you can be Mother Teresa and this student will still think that you are the worst person on the planet, because that inner reality, as you talk about, is very different from their outer reality. And so in your book, I know you talk about the language of trust.
Yeah.
And what can we then do, even though we're doing the best we can, but what other things can we be aware of to make sure that we are putting out this energy of trust that their brains and their physiological systems are going to be able to connect with?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And so, this is really lies at a lot of the heart of compassionate communication as we've developed it. The idea of how do you create that trust, that intimate relationship with another person, that intimate communication with another person. So one of the things that we haven't talked about yet, which may be worth saying right here, is that as much as a communication has to do with language itself and the words that you use, and that obviously is important, and you want to make sure that you are being honest and authentic with the individual so that they hopefully, will come around to trusting you. A lot of trust is engendered through your body language and even your facial expressions. In fact, we sort of cite certain research studies that talk about what kinds of facial expressions are the most trustworthy. And usually, big kinds of facial expressions like big smiles, and certainly, negative facial expressions like scowls and stuff like that, these are not very trustworthy. In fact, one of the really the ideal trustworthy face, as we talk about in the book, is kind of the Mona Lisa smile, what the famous Mona Lisa painting, which is that calm, gentle smile with the soft eyes that engenders a feeling of trust more so than many other facial expressions. And again, if you want to take advantage of some of the mirror neurons, so to speak, that are going on, if you can talk to somebody in a slow and calm voice, if you can look at them with a soft facial expression, like a Mona Lisa kind of expression, then the hope is that they will start to develop a greater sense of trust within you, and that hopefully, through the process, you can try to find some ways of reaching out to them and understanding where they are, and hopefully try to figure out the best ways of communicating with them so that you can understand what the issues that they've been facing, why they don't trust people, or why they haven't trusted people in the past. And I think, again, a lot of it has to do with the notion of, really listening to them so that they understand that they have been heard, reacting back to them, in the sense that what we talk about in compassionate communication is that you want to pay attention to what the other person is saying, and you want to pay attention to how you are reacting. And then by doing that, what you express to them is very authentic with what they're saying. So you get to have a much deeper relationship with them in a relatively short period of time. And we've done some interesting studies ourselves where, within a few minutes, people are having very deep, intimate conversations simply by slowing their voice down, thinking about their facial expressions, staying present, and really reflecting on what other people are saying. So those are things that all can be very helpful at engendering a sense of trust in another person. And these are some of the really key ways that we suggest people do that.
But you know what, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the pandemic and mask and
Yeah.
how much that really takes away from anyone's ability to be able to connect with that Mona Lisa approach that you're talking about. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a no masker.
Right. No, of course.
I just want to talk about then, as we are wearing masks, how that is going to impact so many of the
Yeah.
things that you're talking about.
Well, it certainly does, and it is certainly a problem because people, you can't pick up. It's harder to pick up just the emotional inflections in voice because you can't hear that as well, and you certainly don't see the facial expressions that people are making. Now, we still can take advantage of body language, which is another piece to all of this. And are you sitting there relaxed and seeming, kind of open to the other person and facing the other person? Do you have your arms folded, and are you looking nervous and anxious? So there are ways of doing that even when your facial expressions are not quite as able to get across. But yeah, I mean, this is also all part and parcel of why there are a lot of challenges with the current pandemic. How easy it is to my wife is a therapist, and I know that when she does telehealth visits with people, it's much harder because you don't pick up on the body expressions and the facial expressions nearly as well when you're doing it through some kind of online link or a video or something like that. It just, it's not the same as being in the room with the person and really connecting with them.
Absolutely. And as you were talking before, you were also talking about that negative voice in your head, the negative words. I want to kind of circle back around to that because I think that that's such an important piece for us to recognize how it impacts our students. We can be happy, we can offer this loving environment, we can do all the things that are right, but then the student walks in and that inner dialogue of harsh and critical, the inner voices going on all the time. And this really goes back to where I first met you with your book that is Why We Believe What We Believe. So
Yeah.
let's just open that up just for a few minutes here on understanding the magnitude of our belief systems. And again, from even from a neurological perspective.
Well, our belief systems really do color so much of how we think about the world. We've done some interesting studies that show that the beliefs that we hold actually literally change what we call the primary sensory areas of our brain. So not just, not even kind of once we process through some of that input, but just how we see the world is affected by our beliefs themselves. And then, of course, we take that input and we start processing it in lots of different ways. And then that really, that's another area where all of our beliefs come into play. So, beliefs and the biases that we hold, these are very embedded aspects of who we are. Our beliefs form early in our lives, and we hold on to our beliefs very strongly. And one of the things that is an interesting phenomena, which may bear directly on a lot of your questions, is that when you have children who have had very negative home lives, or really have been struggling a lot, the beliefs that our brain helps us to create do one real main thing, which is to help us to survive. It basically helps us to understand the world around us and helps us to know how to interact with the world around us so that we survive. And if we have had to survive in a very harsh environment, well, that's the environment that our brain and our beliefs basically form within. So when you now go to another environment, as you said, no matter how loving that other or supportive that other environment may be, their brain's reality is still reflecting on this other way of looking at the world. And there becomes this kind of disconnect. So, they look at the world as being very harsh. And now here you come in trying to be very loving and supportive. Well, their brain has one of two options. One option is that they're right and you're wrong. The other option is that they're wrong and you're right. So the problem is that if you are looking out at the world and somebody else is telling you a different way to be, it becomes actually very anxiety provoking if you think that you may be looking at the world incorrectly. And that may be even if you're looking at the world in a very negative way when somebody else is trying to be supportive. So, because as you said, what happens is that contradicts their ways of thinking about the world. And it is far easier for your brain to reject somebody else's perspective and come back and settle within your own, even if it's a very negative and destructive kind of perspective, because your brain thinks that that's what helps you understand the world and that's what helps you to survive. So to say, you know what, maybe the world really is a better place. Maybe these people are really somebody I can trust. While that's maybe a wonderful thing to ultimately be able to come around to, it can be very difficult and challenging to be able to do that because your brain, it's just not the way your brain is perceiving reality. And so it takes energy, literally neurological energy, to break those old belief systems and replace them with a new way of looking at the world. And again, especially if they're going back to the same issues and problems at home, then it becomes really problematic because there's such a contrast between one reality and the other that it becomes very difficult for the brain to be able to, kind of toggle back and forth between, oh, I'm in a loving environment and supportive environment, and oh, I'm not. So you wind up sort of dealing with the more problematic environment because that's the one that you have no choice but to be able to deal with. And it really is a problem. It's a very difficult challenge for all of us to help people to deal with the beliefs that they have held, that even if they are negative beliefs, really, very difficult to let go of because that helps them to understand the world and what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to act. So if in their home life they have to be angry, then they're not going to give that up when they're brought into another situation where they don't even have to be angry, but it's just the way that their way of thinking is.
And I hear that a lot from teachers that will say, well, we can help them at school, but every night they're just going back home to trauma town or to crazy town.
Yeah.
And then, but I do believe that those experiences of giving them something different so that they can know eventually that there might be that situation where there are two very distinct environments. And that's one thing I teach, is to help students to recognize, okay, the minute you get off that bus and you have your foot on campus, then it's a new environment. To rigidly in black and white say, everything you've known from this point, you have the ability to let go because this is a different environment. I mean, it's a
Right.
whole of cognitive piece, but giving them that eventually that experience to be able to see that that really is a truth.
Right.
Because I think is it not a lot of anxiety when you're asking a child to change those beliefs, like you said, even if they are negative and they're not beneficial in the reality of the world, but to let go of those is highly an anxiety producing event for them.
Right. Well, and again, I mean, these beliefs originated when they were 1 and 2 years old and 3 years old. I mean, these are fundamental beliefs that have been written into the neural connections of their brain long before they ever got to, school or anything like that. So it really is a challenge. It's very difficult. I mean, that's why the beliefs that our parents give us in so many ways are often the strongest ones and the hardest ones for us to get past. And whether they are religious and spiritual beliefs or moral beliefs or political beliefs or just beliefs about the world itself, as being a good place or a bad place or a safe place or a dangerous place. Those beliefs, whatever you are, whatever you start with, it can be changed. And as you said, doing the kinds of things that you're doing, that is one of the ways of trying to do that, by saying, at this border, at this, juncture, things change and you can look at the world a little bit differently here. That's all great, but it is a challenge, and it's very difficult when they're dealing with such problematic environments outside of that.
Right. Those survival programs are very hard to overwrite. But I think I have seen it change, and it does take time. But I think that's another point to make
Right.
here, is that it's not going to be overnight. It's
No.
going to take time. Like you're saying, you're having to rewire the brain literally. And so I think that actually brings us right back to the beginning of the conversation of why it is so important to have these compassionate communications and the dialogues and the way that we connect with our students, because there's always that offering that something can be different, the offering that you can move out of this and still be safe. But it's something that ultimately our students are going to have to be able to experience. And ultimately, I think there's a lot of choosing of that and the courage. I mean, deep, deep courage to let go of these survival instincts to be able to then settle their systems. They're fighting not just the thought of it, but also their physiological systems around that as well.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, I mean, these fight or flight mechanisms, I mean, these are fundamental. I mean, there's millions of years of evolution that have given every animal these responses. And those fight or flight, I mean, that's just fundamental to protect us from danger. That's one of the big things that our brain does, is to protect us from danger. So the negative stuff that happens to us, our limbic system reacts. Our limbic system, our emotional centers, this is another part of the problem, is that our emotional centers are deeply connected with our memory centers. Now, to me, it's all, when I originally sort of thought about all that, it seemed a little odd that like a cognitive process like memory would be connected to an emotional process. But of course, that just makes so much sense because, again, if your brain is going to help you survive, you got to remember the things that are emotionally important. It can be positive things. It could be, the love of a parent, but it also can be negative things. Don't go down that dark alley, or don't eat that food or whatever because that made me throw up. And so those things that are very detrimental to our survival, we remember them very strongly. And of course, if they are truly something that is problematic to our survival, then it can lead to more of a traumatic element in our brain. It can become like a post-traumatic stress disorder. Where we just cannot get rid of those memories, and that can be very difficult for people to find ways of working through. I mean, again, the brain is remarkable in that it can always change, but it is difficult to do that. It typically requires a lot of purposefulness to be able to do that. You need to concentrate and work on trying to make those kinds of changes, but they can ultimately come.
It's just beautiful. I think this just talking to you reinforces everything a little bit deeper in the sense that it really is about relationship. If we leave our students to their own devices, they have a lot of negative devices and they're going to continue that. But having those connections with them, the relationships with them, the communication, the dialogue, that we really do have the power to help them and guide them and support them to move into a different direction. And I really appreciate just saw the science behind that, because it's a nice thought to
Right.
be able to do that, but everything you're telling us just reinforces that it's true. It really is a scientifically based way of looking at that. So as we round this out, I could sit here and talk to you for hours, but I know you have things to do and just pick your brain on that. I wanted to actually, let me just read this last quote and then I'll let you fill in anything that you want just to end it up. But
Sure.
in your book, Words Can Change Your Brain, I want to give this quote to our listeners. And it says, when we change our words, we change our brain. And when we change our brain, we change the way we relate to others. The choice is ours. Do we choose to spread negativity with our words, or do we choose to cultivate kindness, cooperation, and trust? And that can't relate any better to the population that we are really discussing here today. So anything to round that out and add any last thoughts?
Well, obviously, I fully agree with what I said. um, but what, with regard to our last conversation, our last question, and even this, one last thought that occurred to me about all of this is something that we haven't quite mentioned yet, which is what we refer to as an inner values exercise. And we talk a lot about speaking and acting from our inner values. And when you have people who are dealing with these kinds of traumas, sometimes it's hard to get them in touch with those inner values. It's a very simple exercise where you basically, have somebody sit down, and it could be any age, and you just say, what is an innermost value for you? You ask them that question, and then they write down whatever comes to their mind. And you may have to, if it's a really young child, you may have to say, well, what's important to you? Whether we try not to define it very much. It could be family. It could be a feeling like respect or love or something like that. And then the question is that, can you, first of all, you can continue to do this exercise really over your lifetime, because your inner values may change as you get older and so forth. But part of what we talk to people about is trying to kind of live your life and communicate with other people from those values. So if your innermost value is love, then are you communicating to people from the perspective of love? Are you loving them? Are you asking them to love you? Is it respect? Is it family? Are you treating everyone like your family? Whatever it turns out to be. But it's a very powerful and very simple exercise to help people get to what that last quote is about, which is to reinforce people's positive ways of thinking about things, to work with the positive values that everyone has somewhere deep within them, and use that in an effective way to help them to move forward and ultimately try to get away from the negativity that might be in their life and go to something which is positive. And I don't mean to make it sound nearly that simple, but all of these different processes, all of these different approaches, they can ultimately bring people to those more positive perspectives. It does take time. And of course, when people have these very ingrained beliefs, as we said at the beginning, they are physiologically in there. The fight or flight response is physiologically in there. So you're always kind of combating those very strong and very physiological processes. But there are other physiological processes that support love, compassion, positivity, that are also in there. And they can ultimately be brought online and help to bring people in the right direction. And that's what the ultimate goal of all of this is about, I hope.
Well, in some sense, it kind of is that simple, but you're right, not really. But on those really complex days and when you're dealing with very just challenging situations, to step back and see the bigger picture from that angle, I think is a beautiful way to just sort of regroup so that you don't lose hope and you don't lose your patience, but you know that that inner value and the ability to consistently be there and to show up and to just love really does come down to that point. So thank
Yep.
you.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you very much.
All right. I so appreciate your time and I just appreciate all the work that you do in this field. It's incredibly valuable.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks again for having me on your program, and happy to make sure that, everything that all the research that we are involved with is available to people. And if anybody is interested, people can always go to my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, Newberg.com. And there's a lot of research there, and as well as the books, and certainly and a way of people connecting too. So.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned that. So again, AndrewNewberg.com. That's where you can find more information on all of this. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
This has been TISConversations. I'm Heather Forbes with the Beyond Consequences Institute. For more trauma-informed resources, please visit beyondconsequences.com. Thanks for listening, and remember, love always prevails.